Why don't more people believe in love? Above all else, this is the question I have felt stirring deep in my heart. Why don't more people believe in love? Because if a person knew love was real, why would they choose to feel anything else? I guess I get to ask myself that very same question. The lessons of love repeat themselves, and yet I still find myself questioning all the beliefs that I've held on to for so long. The songs tell us the history of love. The movies show us the mystery of love. The art on this planet has granted us access to a collective heart we've been handed, but instead of handling it with care, we have filled it with despair, and there have been so many unanswered cries for help, it feels safer not to care. Collectively, we have turned our backs on the meek, taken advantage of the weak, and told the timid not to speak, but love can't be silenced. And so through the generations of violence, there has been a message so timeless that beats deep inside us, and with each beat reminds us that love is still here. Loud and clear, that message rings out. Love is still here. It is near to each of us, and if we look through our fear, it reaches us. So why are so many people still afraid? The way they behave can't be love, can it? I try to understand it, but damn it, it hurts to see us pillage this planet endlessly, torture animals senselessly, kill people for the color skin we see, fueling bigotry while poverty leaves children homeless on the sidewalks. We ignore them so we cannot see their hungry eyes watch us eat ourselves into obesity. And yet in it all, I see the love. We bought the thing to feel worthy of the thing we bought. We ate the food to elevate our mood and ignore the inner war being fought. We have attacked those who think differently because feeling connected meant that the pain we see in them must be the pain I feel in me. And it hurts. It hurts to want to help and not know how. It hurts to want to run and have nowhere to go. And so we have numbed ourselves through violence, ignorance, sex, drugs, alcohol, media, and whatever we could to not feel the pain. And that has been our act of self-love. It seems insane that we would try and choose to love ourselves through abuse, but simply turn on the news and notice the patterns, they are clues that if we don't know how to win, then we are born to lose. And so we can have empathy for those who feel empty, because when they act out, they are simply acting from love the best they know how. And what you and I can do right now is not allow ourselves to forget that even our worst enemies are choosing it. Everyone is choosing love the best they can with the tools they've got. And so they definitely believe in love. It might be me that forgot. Thank you. My name is Adam Roa. I am a spoken word artist and a filmmaker, and I travel the world speaking about the art of choosing love, the complex, nuanced nature of choosing love, and in the spirit of honesty and transparency and vulnerability, I want to share with you that this conference was the first time in a long time that I doubted my message. My friend asked me on one of our first days here, he said, "What are you going to speak about?" I said, "I'm going to speak about choosing love, how everyone is choosing love the best they can." And he goes, "Really?" Like, we just spent all day talking to people and hearing from people who have literally been through the worst. They have been kidnapped, they have been tortured, they have had their friends and their family members killed. And you want to tell them that everyone's choosing love? Maybe you want to tone it down a little bit. And I doubted myself. And I went back to my hotel room and I sat with it and I journaled about it and I meditated on it, and I started to have memories come up of my own trauma. Being molested at the age of 5 by a man that my family and I trusted, and how that led to me walking through the world, walking through this planet with fear. So much fear. In a constant state of fight or flight, feeling like the worst case scenario might happen at any moment. And as I sat with that, I started to think about, when did that shift? How did that shift? Because it was only recently, in the last few years. And I realized it shifted when I was able to drop into forgiveness. And I was able to drop into forgiveness when I was able to drop into compassion and see the act as an act of love. And that doesn't mean condoning it. That doesn't mean saying it's okay. As misguided as I believe it was, I can see that the pain that he was feeling in his life, he was trying to absolve himself of it. And he tried to do that through molesting me. And so as I sat in my hotel room, I realized that as we shine this light of awareness on some of the world's darkness, some of the darkest aspects of humanity, some of the worst human rights violations that are going on right now as we speak, now is as important a time as ever that we continue to hold love in our hearts, that we continue to shout from the rooftops the message of choosing love. Because we cannot dehumanize our oppressors and expect to create solutions that unify the planet. Like Einstein famously said, we can't solve the problem with the same level of thinking that created it. And so as we see the dehumanization that they are doing that allows them to commit these human rights violations in the first place, we get to rise above it. We get to show people a new way, create a new paradigm. And as we can see these oppressors, and we can label them as evil or monster or tyrant, it's important that we not forget the label that unifies us: human. We are all human, and that's amazing, because we've heard from people who get up on this stage and they share their stories of what they've been through, what they've overcome, what they are risking just to be here on this stage, and it inspires us. We look to that and we say, they're human. Their strength, that resolve, that perseverance, That's in me too. But that works in the other direction. So when we see these human beings committing some of the worst acts of human violence on the planet, there's a deep fear in us that goes, wait a second, they're human. Is that in me too? If I was raised with the exact same circumstances, would I be doing the exact same thing? And so when we can hold a lens of love, when we can see it with that, it opens the door for compassion. And when we open the door to compassion, we open the door for a conversation that is rooted in love and has the potential for forgiveness. And it is not easy. No one said choosing love was easy, but I have heard from you, I have felt your hearts, and I know that you have the strength to do it. We have the strength to do it, to show a new way. And it starts by learning to love ourselves more deeply. Not the parts of us that we're proud of, the parts of us that we pretend aren't there, the parts of us we might be ashamed of or feel guilt about. When we can learn to love those aspects, learn to love our deepest shadow, learn to love our ego, the parts of us that carry judgment or anger or resentment, when we can love those parts of ourselves, then when it shows up as a reflection around us in other human beings, we can have compassion for it because we've developed the compassion for ourselves. We can love them because we've learned to love it in ourselves. And this does not mean to accept it or condone it. This does not mean not to fight, to raise our voice and raise our flags and raise that message of love. Do it, but do it with the lens of love. Remember, we are not fighting against, we are fighting for. For love, for freedom. And it starts internally. And that is what has inspired this last piece of poetry that I have to share with you today. And normally the way it works is I say a poem and then everyone claps. We have this exchange of energy. But for this poem in particular, I'd like to take a moment of silence after I finish. And for that to be your permission slip to fall more deeply in love with yourself. To pour appreciation and gratitude into yourself for what it took for you to be here, for what it takes for you every day to wake up and live your purpose and help create a better world. Fall more deeply in love with yourself during that moment of silence. And after that moment of silence, you can clap as much as you want. Can everyone take a nice deep breath in? Out. This poem is called You Are Who You've Been Looking For. You are who you've been looking for. So stop looking for more unless you're looking in a mirror, because it's about time for you to see clearly that you are who you've been looking for. And that empty feeling you got, that hole in your chest, you only got that feeling because you think you're not blessed with everything you need. You see, we live in a consumerist society, which means they need you to buy stuff. And the easiest way to sell it is to tell you you're not enough. Buy this car, you'll get girls. Buy this bra, you'll get guys. And we're seeing it so much that we start believing these lies, but the truth is, the makeup they're selling to make you feel prettier is the same makeup you buy to stop feeling shittier about this lie they keep telling you that you are not enough. And what about the movies we watch, all the shows on TV? The more I watch, the more I see I need you to complete me. And yes, love is the answer, love is the key, but if you can't love yourself, how can you ever love me? And loving yourself, what does that even mean? Like massages and selfies and that sort of thing? Because the more I think about it, the more it feels weird. I've always been taught that self-love was something to be feared. I've been taught that arrogance is bad and vanity, it's not good, and even my bracelets are telling me to act how Jesus would, so what should I do? How should I act? I'm supposed to love myself, but how do I even do that? Well, I got a trick that I picked up from a friend who noticed that I was quick to defend her when she'd say something negative about herself. She'd say, I'm so dumb, and I'd say, you're so brilliant. She'd say, I'm so weak, and I'd say, you're so resilient. And when she said, I feel ugly, and I said, you look beautiful, she asked me why I was so dutifully filling up her cup constantly and yet treating my own cup so irresponsibly. Because when I looked in the mirror, my voice was quite clear. You're ugly, you're too thin, your hairline's receding, and you got a pimple on your chin. And that was when she gave me a piece of advice that changed my life. She gave me a hug, and she said, treat yourself like someone you love. Treat yourself like someone you love. And I had been standing, but I needed to be sitting because I couldn't believe that I had been letting myself keep forgetting that I was who I'd been looking for. And deep in my core, I knew it was time to stop looking for more until I could look through all my fear and look into a mirror and see clearly that the man looking back at me is the only one who can make me happy, and I am already enough. And I am not any more special or unique than you. That is why I'm here to speak to you. You are already enough. And when you start to see that, you will start to be that. Your world will get brighter, your load will get lighter, and you can see that with life, you can be a lover, not a fighter. And that life, you deserve it. Because you are worth it. And there's no point in letting yourself keep forgetting, because no matter what you say or do, you are perfect. And so today I hope I leave you with a direction correction away from the flaws you see in your reflection. They aren't flaws to me, they are simply protection against all the doubts you have of your perfection. So start today. Take a good long look in the mirror and say, I am who I've been looking for. Deep breath in and out. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. When football fans traveled to the World Cup in Qatar in less than 4 years' time, the airport they arrive at, the roads they travel on, the hotels they stay at, the stadiums they sit in, will all have been built with the help of slave labor. Qatar is a tiny authoritarian state. It's also the richest country in the world per capita. It's spending $500 million a week on infrastructure for the World Cup. But it lacks one thing: cheap labor. And so it's been importing hundreds of thousands of young men from the poorest countries in the region, Nepal, Bangladesh, India, parts of Africa, to help it build its World Cup dream. Qatar has a population of 2.7 million people, but 2 million of them are migrant workers. Now, they're not all building World Cup stadiums, but tens of thousands are involved in building the infrastructure for the World Cup. Now, over the past 6 years, I've been reporting on the lives of these men for the Guardian newspaper, based out of Nepal. And my reporting began in the summer of 2013, when every day I would go to Kathmandu's airport, and I would wait outside the arrivals gate and watch as hundreds of men came off flights from the Gulf, pushing trolleys, sometimes laden with flat-screen TVs. It was kind of a symbol of their success, because economic migration to the Gulf does work for some people. But then I would wait, and a different load would come out on those trolleys. Coffins, carrying the bodies of migrant workers. One of them was a young man called Ganesh Biswakarma, and I followed his coffin back to his village.
Ganesh Biswakarma left his home in rural Nepal for a job in Qatar. 6 weeks later, he died of a cardiac arrest. He was just 16.
And so I began to wonder, why are all these young men dying in Qatar? And when I went there, I realized this was not just a story of worker deaths. This was a story of the systematic exploitation of migrant workers on a massive scale. And two things immediately stand out. When you talk to migrant workers, they always bring up the issue of pay. Low pay, late pay, sometimes no pay. I was there last year and I met a group of workers building the Al Wakra World Cup Stadium. And they showed me their pay slip. Some of them were earning as little as 650 Qatari riyals a month, which works out as about 75 cents an hour. And the other issue that always stands out is the appalling conditions in which these workers are housed. They live in vast labor camps like this one, living amongst warehouses and factories, totally segregated from the rest of society. And if you go inside these labor camps, some of them look like this.
This glittering world is built by men who live in a very different one.
त्यही हो प्रब्लम भनेको त्यही हो यहाँ हाम्रो अब त्यो टोयलेट बाथरुम हेर्दाखेरि त्यस्तै छ केही त्यसको सफाइ छैन हैन सब उस्तै छ यहाँ भाडा एक रुममा चाहिँ 12 जना मान्छे हालेछ हैन 2 वर्ष भएको हामीले बेडै सिट दिए छैन भन्छ आफै किनेर ल्याऊ.
These labor camps on the outskirts of the capital Doha are home to thousands of migrant workers. In this camp, over 600 men share just 2 kitchens.
किचन भन्नुहुन्छ भने तपाईहरु गरे हेर्न सक्दैछन् त्यहाँ यति मच्छरहरु र यति सांगलाहरु कीटाणुहरु झिंगाहरु त्यहाँ भन्क्या हुन्छ त्यो झिंगा खानामा बसिन्छ त्यही कारणले मान्छे नि बिमार हुन्छ.
But low pay and squatted accommodation are not in themselves indicators of slavery. Thousands of men become vulnerable to slavery in Qatar for four reasons. First of all, imagine you're a young man in Qatar, a young man in Nepal, and you want to get a job in Qatar. The first thing you need to do is pay for that job. You need to find a recruitment agent and give them $1,000, maybe $2,000 in order to secure the job. But you don't have that money, so you borrow it at a high interest rate. So you're deep in debt before you've even left home. Then you go to the airport and you receive your contract on the point of departure, and you find your contract offers you different pay and maybe different work to what you were promised. But it's too late. You've paid your money, you've got your ticket, you shrug your shoulders, you get on the plane. And when you get off the plane in Doha, the first thing your employer does is take your passport. Think about it. If you hold someone's passport, you hold total control over them. And then you find that you and everyone else who works there are subject to a brutal sponsorship system called kafala. Under this system, you are effectively owned by your employer. You cannot leave the country, and you cannot change your job without their permission. And when you bring these 4 factors together, you have a potent mix that leaves thousands of men vulnerable to bonded labor and forced labor, which are modern forms of slavery. So how have the Qataris reacted? Well, they're an authoritarian state. They're not used to criticism, and they've struggled to respond. When my first report came out in September 2013, first they went after me. They commissioned an international law firm to investigate my findings. Next, they went after other journalists. Then they went after human rights activists. I know of at least 10 who have been detained, arrested, or expelled. But after sustained pressure, things have begun to change. The authorities are bringing in a few reforms that have the potential to change the conditions of migrant workers. But as one activist recently told me, they are glacial and minimal. And on the really big issues, there has not been much progress. The kafala system is still in place. Workers can now leave the country without their employer's permission, but they still are not free to change their jobs. And the Qatari authorities have introduced a temporary minimum wage, but it's only around $200 a month. $200 a month in the richest country in the world. Which begs the question, why haven't they done more? And the simple answer is this: they just don't care. I was recently talking to a Nepali man who had worked in Qatar for a long time, and he said, Pete, there are no human rights in Qatar because there's no humanity in Qatar. And I think what he meant is that the Qatari authorities don't see migrant workers as human. And so in Qatar, and indeed across the whole Gulf, slavery still exists for the same reason it has always existed throughout humanity, which is that one race thinks they're superior to another race. So people sometimes say to me, Pete, are you not frustrated by the lack of progress? Yes, I'm frustrated. The labor camps I documented in 2013 still look the same in 2018. The deaths I reported on in 2013 are still happening today. But I'm also hopeful. I believe in the power of journalism. I believe that when people come together, journalists, activists, workers, football fans, things can change. The World Cup is supposed to unite us. It's supposed to be a force for good, and it still can be. And if I ever do feel frustrated, I think of an email I got from a worker last year, and he said, your article has brought life to us, the low-earning workers of Qatar, reminding us that we are not forgotten, and we too are human. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the next talk will be translated. Please put on your headsets.
Cuba is a small island, a little bit smaller than England. It's underdeveloped, it's subject to economic sanctions, but notwithstanding, the military government stops its citizens from generating income and earning a living, despite of everything you might have heard recently about all the changes that have happened on the island. In reality, only foreigners have the capacity and the right to invest and participate in the national economy. We, the Cubans, are excluded. And this is in the law. But who writes these laws? Well, Congress. But our Congress is not like yours. Since 60 years, the legislative, executive, and judicial branches have been operating together. The separation of powers just does not exist in Cuba. The Cuban Constitution establishes a totalitarian legal system which is based on a single ideology which is determined and interpreted by a single party whose decisions cannot be called into question and they cannot be criticized. They must be obeyed by all citizens and all public officials. This under threat of criminal prosecution. We hold elections every 5 years, but they're not free and they're not fair. There is no possibility for independent candidates to run for election. The same people are always elected, and it's those who defend and impose the same ideology. Unfortunately, I know this system all too well. I'm a lawyer who earned her degree at the University of Havana. I went to law school thinking that I could demand respect and uphold the rights of citizens, just like I saw on television in series such as Boston Legal. But I got a wake-up call. The type of country represented in those laws had nothing to do with the country where I was living. And let me tell you something. That was a huge frustration because I was not able to criticize anything at law school. Nobody at law school could do that because if we criticized the laws, we could be expelled because the university is only for revolutionaries who are loyal to the system. And that was my big disappointment. When I finished my studies, by law, I would have to either be a judge or but I didn't feel ready for that because I felt that that would have to lead me to decide on one of the most precious human assets, which is freedom. And that was not my dream, at least if that meant implementing the laws that I had studied. Because that system really would force me to use a double morality, a double standard, and hypocrisy as a way of earning a living, and I wouldn't stand for that. There's only one organization for lawyers, and you cannot be an independent lawyer. That is the National Association of Collective Law Firms. It's just one association, and it's controlled and run by the government. And lawyers have to defend socialist law, even if that's not in the interest of the clients. Now, I wanted to express my disagreement with the system, and I wrote about the legal system in the alternate press. But the more I wrote, the more readers asked me questions about the legal system. And I understood that Cubans needed to find a way to understand this legal system that was so frustrating to them. And that's why I decided to create CubaLex. CubaLex provided free legal counsel. And during 6 years, we helped more than 3,000 people, most of them who had been deprived of their liberty. And we helped them lodge complaints against the legal system. And this, of course, was without government recognition because that status is only given to groups that are associated and affiliated with the Communist Party. We documented cases of human rights abuses. We talked to international organizations, the Inter-American associations and the United Nations in order to try to safeguard the life and integrity of human rights defenders. We also held hearings and we drew up thematic reports on human rights issues on the island. But this came with a cost. For having done our work, we were the target of the state security. We lost our accreditation, our headquarters were raided, and our IT systems were confiscated. Can you imagine a law firm being raided in Norway and the police taking the computers with all the confidential client information on the computers, never to return them? After many years of harassment and repression, I was forced into exile. And since June of 2017, CubaLex has continued to operate, but we're operating from the United States now. Now, Cuba is the same, or worse. 3 months ago, there was a sham constitutional reform which restructured the state, but it left the system completely intact. Under the new constitution, discrimination is banned, but the right not to be discriminated for our opinions is unprotected. The Constitution formally provides guarantees against illegal detentions, but not against arbitrary detentions, which occur due to the abuse of discretional powers which are legally granted to the agents of the state. Now, what are the results of the application of this law? Between 2016 and 2018, Cuban state agents carried out at least 18,769 acts of harassment against human rights defenders. And this is according to reports from Cuban civil society organizations. More than 95% of these detentions were short-term arbitrary detentions. And in the majority of these cases, the persons were detained without the possibility to communicate. No one had access to a lawyer, especially not during interrogations. The Cuban state has very successfully taken advantage of the discourse on its right to sovereignty and self-determination, and also taken advantage of the political disagreement with the United States and the attendant economic sanctions to justify serious and systematic human rights violations. And nonetheless, no one calls into question the fact that Cubans are living under a system which imposes the supreme duty to serve and defend the socialist homeland. And this can happen even via armed attacks against anyone who intends to topple the system. And this includes attacks against fellow citizens. And it doesn't matter if the means of opposing the regime are peaceful. Any failure to comply with this duty will be considered treason. And in practice, it is considered that any person who has different opinions and who criticizes the policies of the regime is intending to topple the political system, and for this reason they can be harassed by anybody, even the police, anybody. And the international community can do a lot for Cuban civil society. They can continue to create spaces like this one where we can share our stories. But we need to be recognized. We need to be recognized as a legitimate opposition. And this is what would happen in any democracy. Despite any disagreements. In Cuba, we don't have political parties. We don't have a multi-party system because you can't register other parties. There are no legal mechanisms to do so. So we are the only form of legitimate opposition that challenges that one-party system. So please, support our dreams. Our dreams are the same as yours. We want to live in a free and democratic country. Thank you very much.
Morning, everyone. How are you? When we talk about uniting, it's not just about uniting individuals, but also it's about uniting different themes, different unlikely collaborations. Jill has a background in finance, and I think when we gather as human rights activists, we don't often think enough about money and currency and how they impact our human rights and our privacy. Just to give a couple examples, you've heard about the ever impressive police state that's being built in China by Xi Jinping and his cronies, where all financial transactions are being moved onto social media, like WeChat, that allows the government to have easy surveillance over all of your microactivity. Think about the fact that your spend says more about you than your words. Think about in Russia, how when Mr. Putin wants to shut down an NGO or an independent journalist organization, what does he do? He closes your bank account. Makes it very difficult for you to do business, correct? Think about, in some countries, as you've seen, in places like Burma, people are simply deleted from the financial system. So we can start to see how important money and currency are in the spectrum of human rights. Perhaps the most pernicious thing governments do with regard to finance is hyperinflation, which ends up damaging poor and middle-class people to great amounts of suffering. So the Human Rights Foundation is very interested in exploring and researching how repressive governments and authoritarian regimes around the world are basically taking advantage of money and finance to cement their power and extend their rule. And one thing we can do is look at the country of Venezuela as a place where there's some innovation. And we're happy to partner with the Open Money Initiative, which is a new organization that Jill is founding, and she's delighted to tell you a little bit about it.
Thank you, Alex. So yeah, my name is Jill Carlson. I'm a co-founder of the Open Money Initiative. My background, though, is in finance, as you mentioned. I started my career on Wall Street, where I was trading emerging markets debt. So the sovereign debt of many of the countries that we've been talking about and looking at over the last couple of days. And I would spend time reading the statistics and reading up on the policies of these different countries. But it left me asking questions about what does this look like at the human level on the ground. And so that has led to the founding of the Open Money Initiative. We're a research nonprofit that looks at closed economies and failing financial systems. And we look at the human experiences happening there. We've started in Venezuela, which, if you're interested in the statistics, is experiencing 10 million% inflation this year. But what does that actually mean? And what do price controls actually look like? What does confiscation of wealth actually look like in this context? Well, I'll tell you. We've spoken with farmers who would rather abandon their land, abandon their crops, than live under the threat of violence from those who are enforcing the price controls on their crops and on their goods. We've spoken with women, with mothers, who've crossed borders to leave Venezuela, which is one of the largest refugee crises in the world today. And as they've left the country, they've had to evade the confiscation of their wealth from the border guards. And they've done this by sticking bills, their currency, in their hair, in their shoes, and in their bras. We've spoken with church groups who have created entire parallel digital economies on WhatsApp, out of sight and out of mind from their government. And we've spoken with students who run Bitcoin miners at their universities and in their parents' basements as their primary source of income for their entire families. And so we've collected these stories, both stories of oppression, but also stories of hope, in hopes of inspiring products, goods, and services that we can create in service of these places.
So over the next 2 days, come find Jill and I, and we'll talk more about the Open Money Initiative and other ways you can partner with HRF to make a difference in the area of finance and freedom. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Three months ago, I was sitting in the basement of the Tajikistan Ministry of Internal Affairs with a plastic bag over my head. I had been forcibly kidnapped in Moscow by secret services of Tajikistan and Russia and taken back to Dushanbe after having been in exile for the last 7 years. Such incidents happen with Tajikistan activists very often. For a long time, our people have been plagued by oppression, civil war, authoritarian rule, starting with repressions by Stalin in the past, and in repressions by Emomali Rahmon happening now. The current president of Tajikistan, Emomali Rahmon, took power in 1992 by violent armed means. His arrival was heralded by bloody clashes and mass extermination of civilians, which grew into a civil war and continued for 5 terrible years. During this time, Tajikistan lost more than 150,000 peaceful citizens. For 27 years, my country has been ruled by a tyrant. The president of Tajikistan has been using fear and intimidation to maintain power. Fear of a civil war keeps people silent, avoiding discussions of sensitive issues and enduring crimes committed by those in power. The Rahmon family has had complete control of the government and controls every aspect of life for an average Tajik citizen. Corruption is present in all government systems in Tajikistan and on every level. 80% of the country's economy is controlled by Rahmon's family members and is used for personal enrichment. The primary duty of law enforcement and national security agencies in Tajikistan is to combat opposition and punish dissidents. Rights advocates, lawyers, journalists, citizen activists, and opposition figures have all become extremists and terrorists under the Rahmon regime. An open, primal war is being waged against them. In 2008, the day-to-day situation became worse, with frequent brutality against journalists and others who dared to speak out against corruption and human rights abuses. State authorities entered many restrictions related to freedom of speech, and ever-increasing pressure was placed on mass media. Today, it is normal practice for Rahmon's regime to use the mass media as a tool for supporting the crimes of security services and law enforcement. There are no feasible ways to protect oneself against governmental abuses of power. In 2012, my cousin, Umar Ali Kuvatov, realized that people needed changes. In Tajikistan, there wasn't a single group that would be ready to start democratic changes in the country. Then we created Group 24 movement. We sought honest and democratic elections, transparent and independent courts, a country where rule of law is respected and genuine government. But the people exists. We wanted to restore freedom and the right to vote. But forming this group has come at a high cost. In 2012, I made the difficult decision to leave my country to continue my true activism. I faced threats of imprisonment if I did not transfer my own business to the president's son-in-law, Shamsulo Sohibov. These threats of imprisonment turned into death threats. In 2013, I was placed on Interpol's wanted list. In March 2015, Tajikistan intelligence services killed my cousin and Group 24 leader. Umar Ali Kuvatov, shooting him in the head in front of his wife and children in Istanbul. The political regime continues to forge ahead with a campaign of open persecution against my relatives in Tajikistan. My father died as a result of interrogations and torturous beatings by law enforcement agencies. My mother became seriously ill due to constant pressure on her and a state of fear. Health, property, and families of my brothers and sisters are under threat. In 2018, other exiled activists and I founded the People's Movement for Reform and Development in Tajikistan. The primary agenda for the movement was to mobilize the citizenry leading up to the 2020 elections. On February 13, 2019, with this objective, I left for Russia, where almost 2 million Tajiks live and work. However, on the evening of February 14th, instead of going to planned meetings and negotiations, I was abducted by the intelligence services of Russia and Tajikistan in a premeditated operation. Members from the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Russian Federal Security Service placed me in handcuffs, wrapped my head in tape, and put a black plastic bag over my head, without charges, without due process. After beating me and taking my documents, phone, and personal effects, they skipped passport control and put me on a commercial flight from Moscow to Dushanbe. On the plane, I was subjected to beatings by Tajik intelligence agents and Somon air personnel who were helping the intelligence agencies. They kept me bent at the waist for the entire 4-hour flight, while regular citizens sat in economy class behind us. And upon arrival in Tajikistan, I was thrown into the basement of the Tajik Ministry of Internal Affairs. While detained, I came to understand that the operation to abduct me was approved at the highest level in both countries. On February 15, 2019, the Tajikistan Ministry of Internal Affairs officially announced that I had returned voluntarily to Tajikistan. As a confirmation, an operations group under the command of 3 National Security Council generals threatened and pressured me into making a series of staged videos in which I declare that I voluntarily returned to Tajikistan. They forced my mother and my sister to make similar declarations. It is a miracle that I returned from there alive, thanks to the persistent intervention of the global community and European diplomatic corps. I am not the first Tajik to be abducted in Russia, and I won't be the last. There are many people who suffered for their homeland, wanting to see a change there. Maksud Ibragimov, Mahmadruzi Iskandarov, Ehson Odinaev, and many, many others have fallen victims to the abuses, cruelty, betrayal, corruption, and lawlessness of Russian and Tajik law enforcement. All of these people are either currently imprisoned in Tajikistan serving long sentences or have disappeared. Fighting for freedom, equality, justice is challenging, but we have no moral right to stop, even if it costs us our lives and well-being. I want people all over the world to learn about repressions and terror of the Rahmon regime towards the Tajik people and about his corrupted rule. I want all people to open their hearts, turn their gaze, and extend a helping hand to my people who need freedom and democracy. We cannot tolerate this cruelty and impunity from authorities any longer. I could be here today only because of the response of the international community to my forcible taking back to an oppressive Tajikistan. I am a living proof that your voice has power and that someone will listen. Only together, in solidarity, and only using peaceful, democratic means, we will achieve a transformation where human life and freedom become core values in Tajikistan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Bill.
Hi,
How are you?
I'm doing good.
So it's great to be on the stage once again with Bill Browder, who's one of the greatest fighters for justice and against corruption in the world today. Sometimes you have difficulties because of that role. A year ago, you were not here at the Freedom Forum. Why?
Well, first of all, let me say that how delighted I am to be here today. But a year ago, exactly a year ago, I was traveling to Madrid to meet with the chief Spanish anti-corruption prosecutor to give him information about dirty money going to Spain connected to the murder of my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky. I've been invited by the prosecutor. I arrive in Madrid. I go to my hotel. The next morning, as I'm leaving my hotel room, there are two Spanish police officers standing outside my room. And with the hotel manager, he translates and he says, "These guys need to see your identification." I show my identification. And they say, "You're under arrest." And I say, "What for?" And they say, "Interpol, Russia." At which point, the hotel manager was very worried that I was going to leave my stuff in the room, and he asked the police officers if I could have a couple minutes to pack up. I start packing up, and I tweet out, "Being arrested in Madrid right now on a Russian Interpol warrant." I get in the police car, and I don't know whether people are actually going to believe that I was being arrested, and they didn't take my phone away, so I took a little picture from the back of the car from the back of their heads with the dashboard and all the paraphernalia there, and I said, "In the car now." And at that point, everybody realized I was being arrested. I went to the police station. At that point, my story went viral around the world, news alerts and everything. And by the time I got to the police station, within an hour, Interpol called up the Spanish police and told them to release me. And so when I say I'm delighted to be here, I really am delighted to be here today. Who
says, by the way, who says Twitter is not a force for good?
Well, but I'm not the only one with travel problems. Don't you have some of your own?
I don't have quite the problems you have. But it turns out when you do certain things and you make certain enemies, that you have to worry about travel a little bit. I haven't had a particular problem, and I got in here to Norway okay, and I presume I'll get out okay. But the president of Turkey, Erdogan, is not a fan of mine for various reasons. We prosecuted a case of a gold trader named Reza Zarrab, who had been charged and prosecuted in Turkey but then because of connections he had, and because of what I think is monumental corruption and undermining of the rule of law, he was released, the prosecution was ended, various people who were participants in the prosecution of that kind of malfeasance and corruption were fired, some of them were charged themselves. Then some years later we were able to bring the case, and so Erdogan, among other things, tried to get me fired through a meeting with Joe Biden, has accused me, even though I've never stepped foot in Turkey, of helping to foment the failed coup and all sorts of other things. And at a time when Interpol is being abused, one has to worry a little bit when you travel, and I'm not 100% sure that my government will make sure that I'm okay if I travel somewhere and someone's playing games, whether it's out of Turkey or Russia or somewhere else. So anyway, we're all here and we're all very happy about that. Let me ask you this, Bill. So I recently published a book called Doing Justice, and a principal theme of the book is that laws are very important. Constitutions are important. Statutes are important. Lots of places don't have good laws. But as I also argue, good laws are not enough. It takes good people. So at a time when people are worried in America, at least I am, about institutions being undermined, free press being undermined, democratic norms being undermined, truth being undermined, that has nothing to do with the statutes and the law. The laws are pretty much the same in America. What matters often is whether the people who are responsible for enforcing them, interpreting them, are doing their job and are good people and have integrity. So you have spent the last number of years fighting this very important fight, very dramatically and effectively all around the world, to pass a law. So I guess my question is, how important is the law itself to be passed in various countries? And then is the passage of the Magnitsky Act in various countries enough? Or does it also take, as I argue, good people to make sure that it's done properly?
So when Sergei Magnitsky was killed in Russia, and tortured and killed in Russia, I made a vow. I said, how is I going to get justice for Sergei Magnitsky? And at first we tried getting justice in Russia. The Russian authorities said, absolutely no way. Putin personally got involved in exonerating everybody who killed Sergei Magnitsky. They promoted and gave state honors to some of the people most complicit, and they even prosecuted Sergei Magnitsky 3 years after they killed him in the first ever prosecution against a dead man in the history of Russia. So no chance of justice inside of Russia. So I said, how do we get justice outside of Russia? And I discovered that if a crime is committed in one country, like that, and the authorities in that country want to cover it up, there's effectively no mechanisms to get justice. And for me, that was an unacceptable thought, that Putin and his cronies could absolutely get away with murder. And I thought that I just can't live with myself if that's what's going to happen. And then I said to myself, okay, there's no jurisdiction for murder in Russia that you can prosecute in New York, but all these guys, the ones who killed Sergei Magnitsky for sure, and many others, they do this stuff for money. In Sergei's case, he exposed $230 million crime, and they did it for money. And I said, we can take that money, we can freeze that money in the West, and we can ban their visas. And that became known as the Magnitsky Act. And I hear you about the implementation of laws, but let me tell you something. Just the existence of the Magnitsky Act sent Putin into apoplexy. I mean, because there had never been any consequence ever before for his actions. He made it his single largest foreign policy priority to repeal the Magnitsky Act. He sent Natalia Veselnitskaya to Trump Tower to meet with Donald Trump Jr. To say if Trump gets elected to repeal the Magnitsky Act.
That was about adoptions, I thought.
No. And what we've discovered is that it's now globalized. It doesn't just apply to Russians and Putin. It applies to everybody, all bad guys around the world. And all of a sudden, whenever anyone gets on the list, they go out of their mind. But even for every guy on the list who's going out of their mind, there's 1,000 other guys who aren't on the list who are worried about being put on the list. And even if if countries aren't, like the United States, aren't doing this liberally, just the idea of creating a campaign to sanction, a campaign that certain people should be sanctioned, that uncertainty about whether they're going to be sanctioned is a consequence in itself. And so I would argue that in the world that I'm coming from, where there's no laws and no implementation, having a law and a little bit of implementation is a hell of a lot better than nothing.
Can I ask you this? What's impressive to me, a lot of things, your courage, your tenacity, but also you're a private citizen. You're not a lawmaker. You're not in government. You don't have subpoena power like I used to have as a prosecutor. And yet you were able to make a case for these laws in lots of countries around the world. What do you have to say to folks who think, well, I'm not in government, I'm not in power, and that's where actually change can be made, given your experience? And also, by the way, add in there the role of public shaming of governments and officials to get them to do the right thing for the cause of justice.
Well, in a certain way, I have more power than a government official because I'm not constrained to a country, I'm not constrained to a certain protocol, I'm not constrained to the tactics I use. I can go to the press, I can write books, I can do movies, I can do just about anything. And so in a certain way, we all, as activists, if you're vigilant, if you're determined, if you're smart, if you're creative, you can do a lot. And everybody told me at the beginning of my campaign to get sanctions, to get Magnitsky sanctions, is never going to work. They said that to me in the United States. They said that to me in Canada. They said that to me in the UK. They said they're saying that to me in the EU right now. Everybody says it's never going to work. And I would say that the single most important feature of my campaign is that I've never been discouraged. I just keep on hammering away. Sometimes it looks like it's never going to work to me, but I don't spend any time worrying about that, and I just keep on plowing ahead. And I actually, part of the success of the campaign is just the process. It's not even the outcome, it's just the process. By going through and discussing all these issues publicly, by putting officials in a position where they have to say, no, we're going to allow torturers and murderers to come to our country, they end up looking bad. And because I'm in the game longer than them, we end up succeeding in some countries.
And what's the next frontier?
Well, the next frontier is really Europe. So the Magnitsky Act exists in the United States, Canada, Britain, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. But the problem with that is that, and we have a bunch of people sanctioned, a bunch of bad people from all over the world sanctioned. The problem is that they can all come to Europe, and they love coming to Europe, and they particularly love coming to the south of France, to Italy, to Spain. And at the moment, the European Union is allowing these people to come in with open arms, and that really it has to stop. And the problem with the European Union is the European Union has this foreign policy of absolute consensus. So, for example, we're trying to get the EU to do a Magnitsky Act right now, and any one country can block it. And I've been told officially that Hungary is trying to block it. Hungary is a country run by Viktor Orban. Viktor Orban is a good friend of Vladimir Putin's. And so, effectively, Putin has a Trojan horse through Viktor Orban in Hungary to block it, which means that the only way we're going to do this in Europe is to do it on a country-by-country basis, which is what I've been doing.
Does it get harder after you've had a number of successes, because then the countries where you're trying to pass the Magnitsky Act are the more difficult countries? Or does it get easier because people know what it is now? You don't have to explain yourself. You show up and like, oh, it's that Bill Browder guy wants us to pass a law.
I would say that it's just as hard every time. So I've got 6 countries that have done it, and every one of them has said, no, we couldn't do it beforehand, and they did it. And every new country I go to, they say, no, you don't understand our specifics of our country. There's this issue and that issue, and the Russians have big influence here, and there's the far right or the far left or whatever. But in the end, we encountered the same issues. A lot of times the biggest issue is the government itself. So one would think that Putin is my biggest challenge in this exercise, and he's a big challenge for sure. But perhaps my second biggest challenge is the foreign minister of every country I go to. The foreign ministry of every country I go to, their job is to not have any ructions or problems with any country. And so their whole objective is to say, we don't want any problems with anybody, this is going to cause us problems. And the only way that we overcome these foreign ministers is by going to parliamentarians of the country, going to the members of parliament, And so I don't even bother going to the governments anymore. I go to the parliament and I say, do you or do you not want torturers and murderers to come to your country and spend their money in your country? And every parliamentarian can answer that question very easily. No, of course not, we don't want those people. And then those people are the ones who have to put pressure on their foreign ministers and on their governments.
I was laughing a minute ago because, when I was a prosecutor in New York, you look at things through the lens of the rule of law and justice. And without going into detail, we in the Justice Department, and I personally, would have fights with our own State Department and with our own Secretary of State, because my view was, if they had their druthers, if they had their preference, even the State Department in the United States would never let U.S. prosecutors charge anyone in any country ever. I'm overstating that a little bit. Obviously, they care about the rule of law also. But it was always the case that if American prosecutors were trying to extradite someone or trying to, to arrest someone or hold a bank accountable like we did with Bank Paribas, the fourth largest bank in the world, somebody somewhere who was involved in diplomacy thought that it would upset some talk, some treaty, some alliance for some unknown speculative purpose in the future. So sometimes the fight for doing the right thing and for the rule of law and for order and justice and anti-corruption comes up against these legitimate concerns, but they happen in the foreign ministries and at the State Department as well.
And this is where coming back to your question about as an individual versus a member of government, I'm particularly blessed because I'm totally independent. I'm not trying to do business with any of these people in the future. I don't have any careers that I've got to worry about, and so I can go in and cause all sorts of trouble, all sorts of embarrassment. I can go to the press, I can go to the politicians, and I can make a big fuss. And it doesn't look good for a foreign minister to say, yes, we're going to allow those bad guys to come into the country.
Right. But it's not just that. Just as our time comes to an end, you've made a name for yourself doing this. You have a record of success. There's a track record there. And so that is why, going back full circle to the first story, that is why when you're getting arrested on an abuse of the Interpol process and the officials are foolish enough to let you keep your iPhone and you are able to tweet something out, lots and lots of people see it and it goes viral and you have the support. You're not a part of the government, but you have the support of a lot of people who are lawmakers in the U.S. and other places too, which helps a little bit.
Yeah, well, thank God for that. And in a certain way, the longer I do this, the more support I have, and I am on a mission to get this done everywhere else in the world. And I know there's a lot of people here from a lot of countries where a lot of bad things are going on, and I hope that I can work with all of you to expand the Magnitsky Act across the world and to get lots of bad guys who are doing terrible things to you sanctioned in a lot of different countries around the world. Thank you all.
Thank you, folks.
Today, we've heard from individuals in our community, like Bill and Preet, who are doing meaningful work to tackle corruption and human rights abuses by dictators and their networks. And the Human Rights Foundation, too, has begun programs and coordinated efforts with individuals to continue on this important work. We've launched the Anti-Corruption Initiative to ensure that dictators' associates are really placed in a corner in which they need to decide between, on the one hand, keeping their fortunes in safe havens where they choose to vacation and send their children to schools, and on the other, continuing to follow orders to act criminally. And our legal advocacy team is pleased to announce that as part of our global impact litigation program, just this very week, we have submitted our first case file under the Global Magnitsky Act to the United States Departments of State and Treasury. And as advocates for freedom and democracy in closed societies, we're also very proud to be one of the founding members of the Coalition to Free the Kremlin's Political Prisoners. And this coalition is facilitated by perhaps one of the greatest thorns in tyranny's side, Vladimir Kara-Murza, who's with us here today and with whom we've had the immense fortune of collaborating over the years. And so if you've been moved by the content of this forum, and particularly this past session, I really encourage you to please reach out to us and see how you can join this coalition, how you can submit evidence for future inclusion in our global Magnitsky Act submissions. And if you're interested in learning more about the implementation and the effectiveness of sanctions, we have a wonderful panel discussion happening this afternoon on instituting a global sanctions regime. And that's happening at 2 o'clock in the lounge of our mesh space. And you may have noticed that the Oslo Freedom Forum and the Human Rights Foundation, we have a bold new color. And we call that color RISE. And what RISE signifies is the boldness in our actions and the actions of all of you. Because it's people who are really at the core of what we do and why we do it. And that's really what this forum is about, right? It's about having everyone rise up together to unite, to take these bold actions. So please, we encourage you to join us in uniting under one voice and with one concerted action to take that bold step in going beyond naming and shaming and to really coordinate efforts to combat tyranny. And in that spirit, it gives me immense pleasure to welcome to the stage and unite with Vladimir Kara-Murza.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you to the Human Rights Foundation for continuing the tradition of the annual Oslo Freedom Forum, the Davos for Human Rights. On the 10th of December 1975, just a couple of blocks from here, the Nobel Committee hosted its annual Peace Prize ceremony. The laureate, Andrei Sakharov, was not present. Neither were his 4 guests of honor. None of them were let out by the Soviet government. Sakharov dedicated his Nobel Prize to prisoners of conscience in the Soviet Union. He named 126 people. This was not everyone, but it did give an idea. Today, according to the Memorial Human Rights Center, there are 288 political and religious prisoners in Russia, a European country, an OSCE, Council of Europe member state, just a couple of hours flight from here, the year 2019. Oleg Sentsov, a Crimean film director who protested against the annexation. Anastasia Shevchenko, a single mother from Rostov-on-Don, who became the first person in Russia arrested for belonging to an undesirable political organization. Alexei Pichugin, the remaining hostage of the Yukos case, who after nearly 16 years is Russia's longest-serving political prisoner. Oyub Titiev, the memorial leader in Chechnya, who has documented the egregious human rights abuses of Ramzan Kadyrov's regime. Yuri Dmitriev, memorial leader in Karelia, who has uncovered mass grave sites from the era of Stalin's repressions. Just 5 names out of 288. Just as in the 1970s, their best defense, their best hope is international solidarity. It is said that a prisoner's worst nightmare is to be forgotten. Let us remember them. Let us fight for their release in Russia and across the world. And let us unite in an effort to help each and every prisoner of conscience and to help consign that very term to the history books where it belongs.
I hope you're having a great Freedom Forum. I'm having a fantastic time. I encouraged a lot of you to please be sure to be here this morning. And I think even though it got started a little late, it was definitely worth waking up to. Now, tomorrow, I'd like you to also not miss it. What we have tomorrow morning is quite spectacular. We have a speaker from Afghanistan, Cameroon. We have our first trans speaker at the Oslo Freedom Forum, and she's going to be talking about transgender rights and the struggle for that in Kenya. We have a speaker with a very sad tale from Saudi Arabia. We also, some of you may have seen the film that won the Oscar last year for Best Documentary, Icarus, about the doping scandal in Russia. The winner of that Oscar, Brian Fogel, is joining the community, and he will be with us to talk about his film and the impact that that film had. So please be sure to be here at 9:45, no later, in your seats,
so that we can start on time. Because you see, I know how tempting it is to want to keep the conversation going. Because at the Oslo Freedom Forum, the audience is always as interesting as the speakers. So once you start a conversation during coffee or at lunch, you're like, oh, I really want to keep this going. And breakfast is the danger, because then you really get into conversation, and then we're going to start, but yet you really want to continue these conversations. But then they eat into the program, and then that means that we're eating into your lunchtime. So lunch right now is at the Grand Hotel. So you need to rush there as quickly as possible so that you can be at MESH at 2 if you want to join us for the afternoon sessions. The afternoon sessions we're going to have, for instance, I'm going to be leading something with Brock Pierce, an interview with Brock Pierce, one of the top people in the Bitcoin world, who's going to be talking about decentralization and the impact of cryptocurrency on human rights. So lastly, you may have heard of the Gao brothers, not the Mao brothers, but the Gao brothers. The Gao brothers are from China. And I remember when I first came across the name, I looked at a sculpture that they did. And it was a sculpture that really drew my attention because it's a sculpture of Mao Zedong on his knees. And he's begging for forgiveness for the crimes he committed. The Gao brothers take art to another level. The fact is that dictatorships are low trust. They want societies to remain with low trust. They don't want people to get to have a relationship with each other. They want them to have a relationship, with the dear leader, or with the regime, or with an ideology, but not with each other. The Gao brothers' answer to this is something that they're going to be performing here in Oslo, in the public square that is across from Parliament and across from the Grand and the National Theatre. In that public square where we already have an art exhibit, they're going to be carrying out something called the Utopia of the Embrace. The idea, and they've done this in China, they've done this in other places, where in the case of China, they had thousands of people embracing a stranger for several minutes, and then all of them embracing each other. So don't miss that. That's at 7 p.m. this evening. But what I really want you to do is get up out of your seats immediately and go to lunch, and let's go to MESH. And have a great third day. Thank you.